In 1934, the world learned how to laugh again thanks to the arrival of It Happened One Night, starring Claudette Colbert as Ellie Andrews, a spoiled heiress who literally jumps ship when her father, played by Walter Connolly, threatens to annul her marriage to a scheming man, and on her way to New York to reunite with her husband, she finds herself in cahoots with Clark Gable's Peter Warren, a down-on-his-luck journalist with a charisma that could cut mountains, and in exchange for her story, he helps her make her way back to King Wesley, portrayed by Jameson Thomas. In a tale full of wit, affection, and chemistry, the two find themselves falling in love along the way.
There's a lot to dissect about this film. It's interesting to see how the different styles and techniques, mostly through symbols and dialogue, manages to effectively portray sizzling sexual chemistry without sharing one single on-screen kiss. This plays into the nature of the screwball comedy genre that film theorist Andrew Sarris describes as a sex comedy without the sex.
With this in mind, let's talk about the walls of Jericho. In the book of Joshua, we are briefly introduced to the story of the Battle of Jericho, where, during the beginning conquest of the Promised Land, Joshua is faced with this impenetrable city that is fearful of them and their Lord. Ultimately, they are able to march through with Joshua's army blowing trumpets after a period of roaming those walls for 7 days. In the context of the film, the protagonists end up in a motel for the night, posing as a married couple, and almost immediately, Peter establishes a barrier in the room between the beds with a string and a sheet, proclaiming it as the walls of Jericho, which will demonstrate the resultant strength of decency, since, in actuality, she's a married woman and he's a bachelor. Besides the symbolic elements that the film uses, such as falling, staring, and spanking, the movie also utilizes various techniques such as camera angle, lighting, and framing to convey eroticism, the peak scene being the hay sequence.
At the conclusion of the film, Ellie annuls her previous marriage and proceeds to marry Peter, which results in finally sounding the trumpets that announce the tearing down of the wall and crossing each other's barriers. While It Happened One Night reflects the value of the 1930s, where into marriage to have sex, it is astoundingly progressive in promoting the idea that one should marry not only for love, but also with someone with one whom shares chemistry, and refusing the idea of settling down.
From a naive protagonist, we transition to a sharp and witty one with The Lady Eve, a 1941 screwball comedy which stars Barbara Stanwyck from Babyface fame as Jean Harrington, a con artist who, while in the middle of conning with her father, played by Charles Coburn, falls in love with Charles Pike, played by Henry Fonda. When he discovers that she is a criminal, a lifestyle she was willing to give up for him, he breaks off their relationship, which serves as the catalyst for Jean's revenge. Donning the disguise of Lady Eve, she infiltrates his social circle and makes him fall in love with her all over again, which results in a marriage where during the honeymoon, Eve reveals her sexual past, which Charles finds off-putting given the amount of lovers she has had. Scandalized, he leaves, divorces Eve, and runs back to Jean's arms, completely unaware of everything.
While The Lady Eve sounds like a raunchy contemporary rom-com, under the code, it had to get creative with their seduction tactics. In the most sensuous sequence of the film, Jean and Charles are alone in the suite, and Charles proceeds to help her put on a heel and unconsciously starts to caress her leg until he locks eyes with Jean, becoming aware of the intimacy between them. Jean identifies this as a vulnerable moment and decides to exploit it to her advantage by making him sit beside her, lowering him to the floor while sensually rubbing his hair as they talk about the ideal mate. The sensual aspects of this sequence are not only the longing stares, but also the proximity between the protagonists. Jean is a callback to the assertive ladies of the Peacoat era, but a more sanitized version of them, one that is cunning, but ultimately harmless.
In conclusion, The Lady Eve seems to have a particularly problematic view on sex, because through Charles' eyes, being a criminal is easier to accept and more pardonable to being a sexually active woman. His assumptions are based on patriarchal notions of how women present themselves, and instead of trying to fix his marriage with Eve, he reverts to a relationship that is familiar and feels simpler by comparison. The fact that Charles ends up with Jean and not Eve reinforces the societal norms of the time that dictate promiscuous women are not viable for marriage.
In The Lady Eve, Jean has agency and knows how the patriarchal norms work and uses them to her own advantage. But what happens to a woman who isn't as savvy as Jean? In the 1942 film Now Voyager, gorgeous and enigmatic Bette Davis plays Boston heiress Charlotte Vale, who is afflicted by her mental illnesses, which are exacerbated by her overbearing mother, played by Gladys Cooper. Her mental state gets worse until she is sent to a sanatorium where she becomes the patient of Dr. Jackwit, played by Claude Rains, who sends Charlotte to a cruise as a tactic to make her come out of her shell. During the trip, she meets Jerry, played by Paul Heinrich, and they fall in love, despite his being married. They have a brief affair in Rio before returning to the States, where Charlotte can't forget him and struggles to move on from her summer fling.
Isn't this the sexiest plot you have ever heard? Even though the film has dramatic elements, it does contain moments of eroticism. An example of this is when Charlotte is reminiscing about her past and starts narrating a memory about a cruise trip she went with her mother where she fell in love with a naval officer.
Darling, dearest darling. I had read that part in novels about men not liking girls to be prudes. That's all I had to go by, novels. Leslie told me he'd rather have me than any girl on board, or any girl he'd ever known, because I was so responsive. He said that the others were like silly schoolgirls compared to my lovemaking.
Notice how she says that her knowledge mostly comes from books. This gives us insight to her character, and we can deduce that she has lived a completely sheltered life. We follow this memory until this climactic ending when her mother catches her having relations in a car on the cruise. The narrative informs us that this is Charlotte's first act of rebellion, and unfortunately, it cost her her own freedom.
However, she does find solace in small ways of rebellion, from reading what we can presume are erotic novels and in cigarettes. Oh, cigarettes. Hollywood loved you before, they realized you were bad for us. The first use of cigarettes is when the doctor discovers in her room an ashtray full of cigarette butts. Charlotte's reaction is intense, and she asks Dr. Jackwith if he will judge her for it, and what does it say about her that she hides the fact that she smokes from her mother? What does this mean? As the story progresses, the second time smoking plays a part in the narrative is in Rio, where Jerry lights up a cigarette in his mouth and gives it to Charlotte. Even though the film does contain 2 kissing scenes between the characters, the code prohibited the positive portrayal of adultery and long, intense kisses. This is why their kisses are not as long in comparison with the ones that we presently see, and our theory as to why it was allowed during the code. Given the fact that Jerry was married and adultery was a no-no, it's because they don't end up together. The continuing use of cigarettes in the film is to establish a relationship that cannot happen, as they're not only sharing of cigarettes, but the erotic element of blowing smoke at each other's faces, touching even through the smallest of gestures.
Now Voyager is what we consider to be the odd one out of the bunch in our little romp through during code movies, because it's a heavy melodrama and it clearly shows. But the fascinating aspect is how sex is used as an act of rebellion, but sensuality is used as a tool for self-empowerment.
So far, we have seen sex as loving, a revenge tool, and self-empowering. But could it be demoralizing? After the Second World War, America saw themselves as heroes, here to educate the masses of the correct way of living and deliver unto all. 1948, A Foreign Affair, starring Jean Arthur, John Lunn, and the iconic Marlene Dietrich, in a post-war Berlin to assess the living conditions of the Germans and the stationed American officers.
It is through Marlene Dietrich's character, Erica, that we see the echoes of the pre-code dames who use sex as a means to further themselves in society. It is through her oozing sensuality that she manages to not only seduce her way out of an investigation, but secure a provider who would give her necessary valuables in order for her to get by, such as nylon, clothing, and a bed. Even as a survivor and the fact that Dietrich is as charming and charismatic as ever, the audience must never forget that Erica is, after all, The antagonist of the film, a Nazi sympathizer who degrades the moral standards of the American soldiers and serves as a sharp contrast to Arthur's Phoebe Frost, a congresswoman from Iowa who is supposed to encapsulate the proper, working American woman. Phoebe and Erica both have one link in common, and that is their feelings towards Captain John Pringle, who interestingly enough showcases to us a role reversal of the common seduction technique found in previous films, by being the one to use his own sexuality and body in order to distract Phoebe, who is investigating Erica's past, continues a relationship with her that starts as a farce, but eventually he cares for. This moment is later replicated in order to mirror that he also develops feelings for her.
While the portrayal of sex in this film seems contradictory through Phoebe, viewing it as a degradation of American values, and Erica as a means of survival, this only shows the duality and power that sexual acts can possess and be interpreted as, always depending on the audience. Given this was a propaganda film, the view that wins at the end is Phoebe's conservative values, whisking away the American soldier from the degraded Berlin back to the homeland.
So I know what you're thinking. The homeland. Things must be great and star-spangled awesome. But I think it's truly what they seem. Meet Brick and Maggie, a southern couple who only have one issue.
But how in hell on earth do you imagine you're going to have a child by a man who cannot stand you?
Cat on a Hat Tin Roof stars Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman, and it premiered in 1958 when the code was revisited and restrictions were loosened. And it shows. Specifically in two things. One, Maggie's explicit sexual desires, and two, Brick's implied sexuality.
Not since the pre-code era have we seen a woman expressing lust as openly as Maggie the cat, and that was 25 years prior. Although it's clear that the entire Pollitt family is aware of their intimate issues due to the lack of offspring, Big Mama meddles into the relationship and states where she believes the problem is, even though Maggie's desires to be intimate with Brick are not based on procreation. As the first of the movies we touch upon until this point, this one is the one that deals with having children, a direct consequence of having sex, and touches up upon patriarchal systems having certain expectations for women, especially married ones. The fact that Maggie's goal is not to have children, but to finally reestablish the intimacy once had with Brick is refreshing. Having kids seems like a second thought, and Brick doesn't seem so immune to her either.
Which brings us to Brick, a rather interesting character whose main hobby seems to be drowning his sorrows in booze. In Tennessee Williams' original play of the same name, his character is implied to be a closeted gay man. But, given the code's strict restrictions and rules, this couldn't be shown, and what we get is the implication of queerness, alluding to Brick's attraction to both Maggie and his now deceased friend, Skipper.
The film expresses that it's okay for women to feel sexual desire as long as it's directed towards their husband, and outsiders perceive that they're having relations in order to procreate. This highlights a very simplistic view of marriage issues by insinuating that the root of all problems boils down to the lack of sex.
While male writers keep on and on about women's desires solely for their partners, just like the Legion Decency of Catholic Guilt does on and on with sucking away the enjoyment of cinema. Billy Wilder's 1959 classic comedy, Some Like It Hot, demonstrates an eloquent flip to the bird to the ever-present code haze in the shape of cross-dressing, questioning of gender roles, criticism of the male gaze and of its misogyny, and a memorable performance of the historic Marilyn Monroe, all during Eisenhower's White Bread America.
Grim and gritty is the beginning with a 1929 Chicago as the background, where we meet our leading men, Joe, played by Tony Curtis, and Jerry, played by Jack Lemmon, in the wrong place at the worst time to accidentally witness an echo of a real-life massacre. They disguise themselves as women to protect their identities as they flee from raging mobsters and stray bullets, in full makeup and heels. The camera even treats them as such, with the first shot in their new identities, Josephine and Daphne, being that of their legs as they catch the midnight train to the haven of Florida after joining an all-female jazz band.
Wilder's nonchalant attitude to the code is scandalizing enough from the very beginning of Joe and Jerry's heels clacking through the train station. However the hilarity of the situations, Wilder showcases with both men a peace-sided view of those trials women go through, from unwanted attention of strangers to the implementation of the uncomfortable fashion of heels, and they become increasingly aware of how the other lives out.
Not only was the cross-dressing enough to rattle that Catholic guilt, Wilder presents us Marilyn Monroe, a symbol of the ideal woman of the 1950s, in a revealing new dress adorned with jewels as she croons to the screen a sultry rendition of I Wanna Be Loved by You. As Monroe sings and the cocktail dress accentuates her curvy figure with a spotlight centered around her ethereal form in a scene that Roger Ebert describes as a striptease in which nudity would have been superfluous, Wilder cements Monroe's appeal without her ever being distasteful in her performance.
The film concludes with the truth finally being out, but they all don't care, and neither should the changing America. Though Wilder portrays the ending on his cynic humor, the underlying message of acceptance and understanding is present throughout the film. It's not perfect, sure, but
Well, nobody's perfect.
Thanks for watching. This is the second video of a 4-part series. The playlist is down below.
if you want to get notifications whenever we upload, make sure to ring that bell. Also, please make sure to like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you can.
Help us survive capitalism by making our dreams come true by sharing our videos.
And what do we do with bigots?
Fuck off my swamp!